Something is shifting in the Middle East, and most Americans have no idea it's already happened. For decades, US military bases scattered across the Arab world were the unspoken language of American power. They didn't need explanation, they were the punctuation marks of a sentence the whole world had already read. But Russia, a country many in Washington had written off as a declining power, has now delivered a direct message, not through diplomacy, not through back channels, but through the kind of language that serious powers use when they're done being polite. And the Arab government's listening. They're not dismissing it. They're calculating. Because in a world where the dollar's grip on global trade is loosening, where BRICS is no longer a theory but a functioning alternative architecture, and where China is signing security deals in neighborhoods, America once considered exclusively its own, the question of whose military presence legitimizes a government and whose presence now threatens it has fundamentally changed. This is not speculation, this is the architecture of a new world being built in real time. Let's start. The US military presence in the Arab world has never been a simple story. It has always been wrapped in layers, layers of alliance, layers of energy economics, layers of Cold War logic that somehow survived the Cold War itself, and layers of domestic politics both in Washington and in Arab capitals that preferred certain arrangements remain unspoken. The bases were there, everyone knew they were there, but publicly, many Arab governments treated their existence the way you treat a family secret, acknowledged only when absolutely necessary, and even then with careful language designed to soften the political discomfort. That was the arrangement, that was the deal. And for a very long time, it worked, or at least it worked well enough that nobody with real power felt compelled to disrupt it. But Russia's recent posture toward the Middle East is not a diplomatic courtesy. It is a deliberate strategic communication, the kind that serious powers issue when they want other serious powers, and the governments caught between them to understand that the rules of the game are no longer what they were. Russia has made clear through statements, through military positioning, through its relationships with Iran, Syria, and increasingly with Gulf states that were once considered firmly in Washington's column, that the presence of American military infrastructure in the Arab world is no longer something it intends to treat as a fixed and permanent fact of life. That is a significant shift, because when a major power signals that it no longer accepts the permanence of another major power's military footprint in a strategically vital region, what it is really saying is that it no longer accepts the underlying political order that footprint was designed to enforce. To understand why this matters so deeply, you have to go back not just years, but decades. After the Gulf War in 1991, the United States established a level of military presence in the Arab world that had no modern precedent. Bases in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, the entire Persian Gulf region became, in practical terms, an American security zone. The logic was straightforward enough at the time. Iraq had just invaded Kuwait, Iran was hostile, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and the Arab states that sat atop the world's most consequential energy reserves needed protection, or at least believed they did, from regional threats they couldn't manage alone. So they invited American power in, and American power came, settled, and never really left. What followed was a kind of mutual dependency that shaped everything. The Arab Gulf states got security guarantees. Washington got basing rights, intelligence cooperation, and the ability to project force across the entire region and into Central Asia. The dollar remained the currency of the global oil trade, the petrodollar system, which meant that American financial power and American military power reinforced each other in ways that were almost impossible to disentangle. If you wanted to buy oil, you needed dollars. If you needed dollars, you were connected to the American financial system. And if you were connected to the American financial system, you were operating within a set of rules that Washington had enormous influence over. The bases were, in that sense, not just military installations. They were physical expressions of an entire global economic and political architecture. Now think about what has changed, and think about it seriously, because the changes are not superficial. The shale revolution gave the United States domestic energy production that dramatically reduced its structural dependence on Gulf oil. That sounds like a purely American story, but it isn't, because it subtly altered the political calculus of the relationship. When Washington's own energy security no longer depended as directly on Gulf stability as it once did, the emotional and strategic urgency behind the alliance began to shift slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it shifted. Arab governments noticed. They began asking questions they hadn't asked before, or hadn't felt safe asking before, questions about the reliability of American commitments, about what the United States was actually prepared to do in a crisis, and about whether the protection being offered was still worth the political cost of hosting it. Then came the Abraham Accords, which were genuinely significant, not because they normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states, though that was the headline, but because they revealed something deeper about how the region's power brokers were recalculating their positions. The Gulf states that signed were not doing so primarily out of idealism. They were doing so because they were diversifying their strategic relationships, hedging against uncertainty, and signaling to Washington and to everyone else that they were capable of making their own decisions. That is a different posture from the one those same states had maintained for 20 years. It is the posture of a government that no longer sees itself as entirely dependent on a single patron. And then Russia made its moves. The intervention in Syria beginning in 2015 was the moment that changed the regional calculus in ways that are still being fully understood. Russia went into Syria when almost everyone in Western capitals expected it to become Moscow's Afghanistan, a quagmire, a humiliation, a strategic overreach. That is not what happened. Russia achieved its core objective, which was preserving the Assad government and maintaining its own military presence on the Mediterranean. It did so at a cost that, by the standards of major power interventions, was remarkably low. And in doing so, it demonstrated something to every government in the region that was watching, which was all of them. It demonstrated that Russia was a power that could intervene, achieve defined objectives, and sustain a military presence in the Arab world without the kind of catastrophic political blowback that had damaged American credibility after Iraq. That lesson landed. It landed hard. What Russia has been saying to Middle Eastern governments since then, sometimes explicitly, sometimes through the architecture of its relationships and its arms sales and its diplomatic positioning, is that the era of uncontested American military dominance in the region is over. Not that it ended yesterday, not that American bases are going to disappear tomorrow, but that the political and strategic assumptions on which those bases rest are no longer as solid as they were, and that Arab governments need to think carefully about what aligning themselves too closely with a declining unipolar power means for their long-term security and sovereignty. That is a sophisticated message, and it is being delivered to audiences that are themselves increasingly sophisticated in the way they think about global power. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia in particular, have been navigating this with a precision that is not always appreciated in Western commentary. The instinct in Washington has often been to interpret Saudi or Emirati hedging as a kind of temporary disloyalty that can be corrected with the right package of arms sales or diplomatic reassurances. That instinct is wrong, and it is wrong in a way that reveals a deeper misunderstanding of what these governments are actually doing. They are not being disloyal, they are being rational. They are looking at a world in which China is their largest trading partner, in which Russia has demonstrated staying power in the region, in which the BRICS grouping offers an alternative to dollar-denominated trade, and in which the United States has repeatedly shown, from the withdrawal from Afghanistan to the oscillations in its Iran policy, that its commitments can be uncertain. Given all of that, hedging is not disloyalty, hedging is strategy. Russia's warning to the Middle East is, at its core, a warning about the cost of remaining too closely bound to a power whose influence is contracting. It is telling Arab governments, particularly those that host American bases, that in the emerging multipolar world, that hosting comes with risks that did not exist a decade ago. Not necessarily military risks in the immediate sense, but political risks, economic risks, the risk of being on the wrong side of a global realignment that is happening whether Washington acknowledges it or not. China's Belt and Road investments across the region, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's expanding membership, the de-dollarization discussions that are no longer theoretical but are being operationalized in actual trade agreements. All of this creates a context in which American military infrastructure in the Arab world looks less like a guarantee of security and more like a potential liability. This does not mean the bases are going anywhere soon. The inertia of existing military arrangements is enormous. Governments don't expel foreign bases lightly, and the economic and security dependencies built up over decades don't dissolve overnight. But the political conversation in Arab capitals is different now than it was 5 years ago. There are voices in those capitals, serious voices, not fringe voices, arguing that the strategic benefits of hosting American forces need to be weighed more carefully against the costs, including the cost of being drawn into conflicts that serve Washington's interests more than their own, and the cost of being seen, in a world increasingly skeptical of American power, as subordinate partners in someone else's imperial project. What Russia is doing fundamentally is accelerating a rethink that was already underway. It is not creating doubts about American reliability. Those doubts were generated by American behaviour, by the Iraq War, by the chaos that followed the Arab Spring, by the abrupt exit from Afghanistan. Russia is simply making sure those doubts are not quietly set aside, that they remain present in the calculations of every government in the region. It is doing what capable powers do in competitive environments. It is working the space that its competitor has created through its own missteps. For the American audience watching this from home, the temptation is to frame all of this as either a threat that needs to be met with more force or as enemy propaganda that shouldn't be taken seriously. Both of those reactions miss the point. The point is that the world is genuinely reorganizing itself, and the reorganization is happening according to a logic that American foreign policy has so far struggled to fully come to terms with. The bases in the Arab world were built for a particular world, a world where American power was uncontested, where the dollar was unchallenged, where Russia was contained, and where China was a manufacturing platform rather than a geopolitical competitor. That world no longer exists, the bases remain, but the world they were designed for has moved on. The question that should be occupying serious minds in Washington, and increasingly it is occupying them, even if the public conversation hasn't caught up, is what American strategy in the Middle East looks like in a world where the assumptions underpinning it have fundamentally changed. That is not a question with an easy answer. It is not a question that can be answered by simply spending more on defence or by doubling down on existing alliances without asking why those alliances are under strain. It requires a kind of strategic honesty that is difficult to sustain in a political environment that rewards simple narratives over complex realities. Russia's warning to the Middle East is, in the end, also a warning to Washington. It is telling the United States that the architecture it built after 1991 is crumbling not because of Russian aggression, but because of the accumulated weight of its own contradictions and the emergence of genuine alternatives. That is an uncomfortable thing to hear. But the discomfort of hearing it does not make it any less true. The bases are still there. The question is what they are actually protecting and for how much longer the governments that host them will conclude that the protection is worth the price.